Welcome back. Colleen Shogan is the former archivist of the United States. You might remember President Trump fired her early in his second term for no apparent reason. She is now leading the In Pursuit essay series, which honors presidents and first ladies ahead of America's 250th anniversary. Here's my conversation with Colleen about the latest works from that project and a whole lot more. The newest essay in the In Pursuit series, Martin Van Buren. Now, there's also one I saw, Andrew Jackson. A lot of people sit up and Andrew Jackson. Well, let's hear more. Martin Van Buren, not so much, but he still deserves an essay, right, Colleen?
Well, absolutely. I think all our presidents deserve an essay. Yes, absolutely.
That's kind of the point, Major. Yes. You know, you want to catch up with us?
But Martin Van Buren comes at a pivotal time in American history.
Why?
Because
what's so pivotal about his time, and how was he able to measure up or not quite measure up to that testing time?
Well, he's the successor to Andrew Jackson.
Right.
So actually, Jackson leaves him a number of challenges. There's Jackson kills the bank, as you might remember, the second bank of the United States. But that
not from living memory, but I've read about it.
Yes, and yeah, right.
Some might confuse, looking how old I am.
And then Van Buren has an economic crisis that he inherits from Jackson, and that really complicates the Van Buren presidency. And of course, he has the slavery crisis as well to deal with.
Not to mention, a fair amount of the Jacksonian policy of Indian removal has to be carried out under Martin Van Buren's presidency. Another massive complicating factor.
Sometimes we see this with presidents like Jackson, who are particularly forceful. We see them change politics, reconstruct politics, but it's then their successors who are often left with the ramifications of their policies.
And there's a kind of painful irony about Martin Van Buren in that he was this coalition builder. Coalition builders always try to not only bring people together, that's self-evident, but in this time and place, Martin Van Buren wanted to minimize or at least soften sectional divisions. Well, they were only getting more sectionally divided over the issue of slavery.
This is what we'll see from this period forward with our project, yes, with In Pursuit, is attempts by presidents. And we often view them as not successful presidents or weak presidents. But another way to look at it is that these conflicts and these crises were so powerful that they overwhelmed the institutions that they were leading, and it would, in fact, take a civil war in order to solve them.
A series of one-term presidents, not entirely undone by slavery, but dramatically having their presidencies sort of stalked and haunted by the sectional divisions that only kept getting more intense over the question of slavery.
Absolutely, and the limits of compromise in a democracy is one of the big lessons that we're going to be learning from In Pursuit. We think in a democracy, which is correct, in a large democracy, that we need to have compromise in order to move forward. But sometimes when you compromise moral principles, that actually only puts the problem off, or in some cases, makes the problem worse.
And that's what many of those presidents after Van Buren tried to do. Find ways to compromise a way around slavery. In the end, we couldn't do that, in part because it was handed off by the founders. And the sense was, look, the founders set this in motion. They must have been more right than wrong. There was that predilection to believe the founders had a chance on this one, kept it, so that held a lot of presidents and the political conversation back for many, many decades.
Well, recall that when Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence, he did the primary draft of the Declaration, that there was a lot on slavery and the condemnation of slavery, and basically, even though Jefferson himself was a slave owner, but blaming England, blaming George III for the propagation of the slave trade. And all of that came out of the Declaration because, quite frankly, they couldn't get the signers for the Declaration if that stayed in. But that's the first example in which there was an attempt to deal with it or attempt to reckon with it, but it's put off.
And it also flows to the Constitutional Convention. It was a much more lively debate then than it was like 60 years later, when it had become baked into the economic reality of America and the colonies and those that came after that. There was a chance. It was missed at the formation of our country, and then it sort of became embedded in the economic realities, principally of the South, but also of the North. They knew about it, And then it became much more harder to deal with politically. And ultimately, politics didn't solve it.
That's correct. Absolutely.
The Civil War had to solve it.
Yeah, there wasn't going to be a compromise that was going to solve it. And of course, we know in American history there was a number of attempts: the Missouri Compromise, Kansas-Nebraska Act, the switch to popular sovereignty. But none of these attempts were actually going to be able to solve, which was ultimately a moral crisis.
You can listen to my full interview with Colleen Shogan on your favorite podcast platform.